Welcome to the Actionable ESG Talk series, brought to you by AKFI, the Actionable Knowledge Foundational Institute, the world's first nonprofit industry consortium committed to bridging the gap between ESG, sustainability, and digital transformation, I shall say AI. Actionable ESG Talk series bring together great minds to discuss the current state and future state of ESG, sustainability, and digital transformation. I'm delighted to be here with our guest, Richard. Richard Cellini is the Executive Director of Future Proofing America, a 501c3 nonprofit across the nation's leading design, architecture, engineering, construction, real estate, insurance and reassurance, mortgage, traditional banking and private equity, public finance, rating agencies, and data analytics firms, all with a common mission to meet and exceed 11 times, 1 to 11 times, or better, 11 times or better cost benefit in the value of resilience across residential, commercial, industrial, public sector assets. Also including facilities and infrastructure. So again, welcome, Richard, to our talk. And without further ado, let's dive in. We'll start with trends in sustainability and resilience, where you have a lot of work and experience, and I hope you're going to share a lot with us today. Well, let's start with emerging trends in sustainable investing, the latest trends, and how do you see the influencing investments decisions in pre-disaster, actually, risk mitigation play in the market?
Yeah. So, Manuel, thank you for doing this. I know you've been, conducting these sessions, and for quite some time, and I'm honored to join a long list of folks that you've had engaged in this. And I think the work that you've been doing helps educate a whole range of folks across different backgrounds. What I'd like to do, if I can, is I want to share my screen and share just a few kind of setup points of how what we've been working on in this Future Proofing America thesis, so to speak, and to answer your question. Can I do that?
Absolutely. You are our guest. You can do anything you want.
Okay, so let me make sure. Sorry. So our our focus is on community assets, facilities, and infrastructure, as you mentioned, and it really is intentional, to address something that is gotten to a point where it's what we call a Gordian knot. Gordian knot, as you and I discussed, is something you just cannot untie. It's just too difficult. And these two maps kind of represent, a little bit of, the yin and yang of where we are in America, true in different parts of the world as well. So we know inherently, all of us know inherently, that something has changed and gotten worse. Our heat patterns are not only persistent, they are longer in their time. It used to be, in Houston, where I am, you could pretty much count June, July, and August being, the hot months of the year. That's gone. We have heat that goes through winter months just as much as we may end up having snow, 5 inches of snow on the ground. So you take a look at the intensification. As you also know, we had a tropical storm Michael many years ago on the U.S. Gulf Coast. On a Tuesday afternoon, it was a tropical storm. By Wednesday afternoon, it was a Category 3, soon to be a Category 4 hurricane. So we know that there's intensification happening. And on the right-hand side, I hate to say it, but this has become, a map that details where you do not want to live because of the persistency of these weather climate events, right? What's unusual is in some of these areas on this map on the right-hand side, Manuel, people are still moving there. Businesses are still moving there. Doesn't make a difference how bad the patterns are. So we started looking at, realizing several years ago, this isn't $1 billion event one year and then another one next year. We've got billion-dollar events, one on top of each other. And this is just an example of just, a snapshot of the articles in the media that are hitting folks on a persistent basis, right? And you can see a theme in these articles. They talk about natural disasters, they talk about insurance and mortgages and financing, which begin to connect the dots that we felt these were the six significant hurdles to what was happening in the United States. That if you could put real attention to addressing these six, you could actually move the ball forward. And Manuel, we, over the past 2 years, we've held a series of invitation only roundtables called Transforming Resilience Investment. We did the first one with the Dallas Federal Reserve. We did another one in Denver with the Denver Chamber and Inosphere, which is a Colorado and Wyoming ecosystem. We did another one up in New York. So we've had this opportunity to bring well over 300 senior representatives and executives in these areas of real estate, insurance, reinsurance, mortgage, financial institutions, elected and appointed officials. And I know that these are small, but I'm just going to highlight very quickly what you're going to see on these next set of research that we've conducted is there is no graphic that's going in the right direction, all right? Meaning the number of uninsured losses continues to increase. The cost of disasters on residential, commercial, and public sector, going through the roof. You add in federal government, the cost to the governments alone, just on public infrastructure, going through the roof. The disconnect, as I mentioned, between, who's insured and who's not leads to also the amount of mortgage defaults that are occurring, meaning if you can't get insurance, you can't get a mortgage. That's one aspect of it. But also, if I've lost my asset, meaning my home or business, I can't pay the mortgage. And then we're seeing, as I mentioned, this corresponding asset devaluation, meaning if you live in these areas that are persistently hit by disasters, it is over time losing its value, which then we looked at what's the cost to real estate developers to bring their assets up to a higher level of resilience, which they know they have to do. But we've got to find a way to work with developers to not only make their assets more sustainable, more green, but also more resilient. And they're not, it's not an either or. Elected officials are overwhelmed of having to go back to taxpayers. And then, sad but true, you start seeing different sectors, agriculture, manufacturing, different sectors are being negatively impacted and are forecasted to be negatively impacted in the billions of dollars. Oh, and this is where I'll stop for a second, Manuel, after this, is we have relied in the United States heavily on the federal government to step in. FEMA, Small Business Administration, Housing and Urban Development, several, congressional appropriations. Well, that's gone. That day is over on the reliance upon federal agencies and the federal treasury. So there's a massive transition in the federal role, responsibility, and resources. But Manuel, it's almost like a shock that I didn't realize this. The number of disasters occurring that never reach the level of a federal or presidential declaration, right? There's an eligibility. You got to hit a certain
Mhm.
set of requirements. More and more, those disasters that are occurring do not hit that eligibility. So that's the reason why state and municipal forecasts are now completely thrown. So I know I sound like the Vin Diesel of doom, but frankly, what we have felt was yes, all the numbers are going in the wrong direction, all the indicators, all the forecasts, including on the financial, economic, fiscal, and societal impacts. But the truth be known, Manuel, and you've had all these guests that can quantify this prior, is, and some of your listeners, of course, is there is something we can do about it. So I'm going to pause there to say, hopefully, I know that's a lot, but we have the empirical data and the evidence and the forecasting tools. It's really now a question of how do we actually stop studying it, wringing our hands, and really start doing something?
So, Richard, the first thing, thank you. It's really compelling. The argument is compelling. It makes me think actually that sustainability is mostly about reporting about the past. And when we move to strategy, sustainability should be called resilience, because that's where the investments have to move to. That's where the insurance industry, the finance industries have to work together. This is, as you mentioned, governments at different levels have to work together. I'll start by saying you actually also describe a vicious cycle where actually now hits on the consumers themselves. You know, homeowners. What is the biggest asset in U.S. For most of middle class? Homes, right?
Or their
Uh,
cars, and or their cars, right?
and or the cars, both affected by weather, but
Yeah,
focusing on the homes and the construction industry and the real estate industries, they seem to be heading toward the I'm sort of non-resilience event. I don't want to call it disaster, although it's
right.
probably warranted to call it that way. And as you observe these trends, how do you see the capital flowing and how it helps, you know, how the finance industry helps through the integration of insurance, reinsurance, public financing, private equity, all you know,
Right.
all the
Right.
finance industry to drive sustainability, to become resilient?
Well, look, you know, the phrase actionable ESG, I want to connect actionable ESG, actionable intelligence, and actionable investment. They're all interrelated. As you know, we both realize one of the issues has been everybody's been kind of stovepiped in their corner and their relationships and networks. So that's got to end. So actionable ESG, actionable, intelligence. Let me play off of that. We now have more data than we ever have, and we're only getting more by the minute. So we are drowning in data and thirsty for intelligence, right? One of the issues is most of the insurance and reinsurance and financial world has relied on looking backwards. What's happened, kind of what's underway. Okay. And you can kind of feel comfortable knowing what's happened, but that doesn't make a dang bit of difference anymore. It really doesn't. Because if I said at the beginning, Manuel, and you and I talked about this before, if I know that things are intensifying, all right, if I know that there is more of a preponderance of very large scale events, whether it's wildfires or hailstorms, all right, I've got to be looking out ahead. I've got to be looking forward. Um, and I've got to go kind of from a worst case scenario to, what is called the average annual loss, right? That's kind of the phraseology.
Hmm.
So to answer your question, it always starts with the data and the actionable intelligence. And where we're hearing directly in, you know, confidential off the record conversations and interviews, and then in some of the public forums that we've hosted and held and participated in, when you've lost 4.5 to $5 trillion since the 1980s, 50% alone in the past decade. The model for insurance, reinsurance, mortgage, financing, banking, it's broken and everybody knows it, right? So my leadership, my board, our collaborative partners under the Future Proofing America umbrella are really listening intently to this idea of pre-disaster investment. It's so much a natural thing. Healthcare took it on saying if you exercise, don't smoke, reduce, bad behavior, the chances you're going to live a lot longer and your health is going to be a lot better. Well, it's no different in these disasters. So what we're seeing now is the emergence of what are called resilience credits. If I invest in my asset, whether it's a residential, commercial, industrial, even public asset, if I put money in it to de-risk, meaning to reduce the future exposure, you're beginning to see resilience credits and new types of insurance products, reinsurance products. Mortgages are beginning to look at repricing. And last, I won't let the genie out of the bottle, but one of the three major ratings agencies that we've been working with has brought forth and will roll out with us in December a review of how they have been rating public large scale infrastructure and how they believe that if public infrastructure is made more resilient or more future proofed, that their ratings will be better, meaning the
Mhm.
financing will be cheaper or less expensive. So I think you and I are seeing 2026 as being that year that we've been hoping the domino would finally begin to fall. Does
Mhm.
that make sense? Meanwhile,
Makes a lot of sense. Sort of a short note, I was reading recently about disaster bonds, for instance, as a way to get the private investors connected to the exactly what you described, this mechanism of actually over emphasizing the historical data and not realizing there are discontinuities, grave, significant discontinuities, as you describe.
right,
So, we talk actuary tables, for instance, 50 years, 100 years.
right.
Probably they continue to be historically important. The question is how much the predictive power they have left when we superimpose the sustainability, as you mentioned, the ESG, all the other factors that we observe was very well represented in your
Yeah,
slides.
but let me play off of that. Let me play off of that because you're smarter about this than I'll ever be. Um, the the reality is we already know what's happened. That's behind us. What we need to understand, and this is where, AI and blockchain and forecasting, but also let me add something to it. We've got a lot more sensors and meters and ways to ground truth, meaning to really understand what's happening on the ground and
So true.
kind of that curve, right? What is giving us prior indicators. We also know we can also look upstream and get real time information so that we can alert and change downstream circumstances. Okay.
Absolutely.
And then the other part is concrete and rebar is not the solution to everything.
No,
My engineering friends are going to hang up after hearing me make that statement. Concrete and rebar very much has a role, but we know, your listeners know that nature-based solutions, including the absorptive capacity, the use of green, detention and retention structures. All of these things fit into that puzzle, right? That puzzle that if you can now look at all of these pieces, not only one, but all these pieces as a part of your financial model, your capital stack, then the chances are you are going to bring more capital to the table that's aligned, and the results are that the asset will preserve its value and the tax base in the community will retain its asset, its tax base. So we're kind of at this point, Manuel, where it's like it's a no-brainer. What we're puzzled by is what does it take to cross the chasm from doing what we constantly do and are comfortable with to what we need to do and what we know should be done.
Well, you brought the medical comparison, and if everybody will respect the what we know about medicine today, uh,
Right.
particularly preventive medicine, right? The early
Yeah.
diagnostics and so on. It's exactly the same model. Costs are lower, the health of the patient is better, the socially, but we don't do it, or we don't do it at scale. And
We human animals, God love us, you know, we and then we have some major illness and we're praying to God and the doctors and the scientists to
exactly.
turn us around
And
and it's more expensive.
there's the
Yeah,
time where we stop smoking, for instance, if you
yeah,
have been smoking the whole life and so on,
yeah,
and hoping that, this last minute uh, coming back, right, from the wild will help you. And we know
yeah.
that this is where medicine actually has the most cost, the most complex parts, but we don't do it. We don't do it in most at government levels, right? We cut funds. So I think you're describing an ecosystem which is unfortunately, and I don't want to say it that way, but it's normal as usual or business as usual.
Yeah, but this idea that, I mentioned Carolyn Kuski when she was at Wharton up at University of Penn, and now she's
Right.
at Environmental Defense Fund. She really did the seminal work that said it's an obvious 1 to 6. So for every dollar you spend ahead of, the next disaster, you're going to recoup it by having $6 of cost benefit of reduced risk exposure. Okay. Then there's been a series of studies for 1 to 11, and then the U.S. Chamber recently came out. I'm a little stunned with a 1 to 33. Okay. Whatever that 1 to X ratio, cost benefit, it's obvious. Here's what we're believing is underway, and where again, 2026 may be a seminal year. You can just keep on doing what you're doing, Manuel. But by the way, you're either going to have to pay more in insurance or you won't be able to get insurance. You can't get insurance, you can't get a mortgage. All right. Can't
Right.
get a insurance and can't get a mortgage. This whole affordability throws the entire housing market for a curve, which is already underway. Right.
Absolutely. Louisiana seems to be the one of the states that are already experiencing that.
Well, that in California and other places. But look, what we also know is when we did this work with the Reinsurance Association of America and US Chamber and others to get the Community Disaster Resilient Zone Act, CDRZ, which essentially identified 4,000 census tracts in the United States based on the data labeled as most at risk, meaning high disaster vulnerability, and most in need, high social vulnerability. We essentially recognized for the very first time that low to moderate income communities we're persistently hit with disasters disproportionately to other parts of economies. All right. By the way, that's your workforce, that's your small businesses, that's your educators. So the fact is, the realization that disasters have now tipped into an economic consequence in a cascading, right? You can ignore it, but I'm telling you, the penalties for ignoring it are continuing to rise. At a certain point, the pain threshold for people not doing stuff, Manuel, I think is going to hit.
I think you're absolutely right, and you make me think of the way people invest, for instance, as a proxy, right? So they have all this rational data, hundreds of years of performance, companies, they have hundreds of metrics, 3 months reporting from the executives, right, on the financial reporting.
Right.
Why they behave emotionally? What makes so it's exactly this tipping point which you describe where they shift from I have data and you did a great job showing some of the key data. So I don't think we have a lack of data. We don't have a lack of tools. We can use AI now to
Right.
present data and so on. We have a lack. We have this problem of transferring the information from static, if you want, to action. And when we go to action, it seems to be a mix of emotional and data, or even forget about the data. Yes, you told me all this 1 year ago, but now it's
Right.
happening. Now I have to get out of the home because it's a fire or a flood. So that's
Look,
the emotional part.
right. No, no, look, the emotional quotient. Um, we live in a country, decide what you want to do, when you want to do it, and how you do it is built into our DNA. We also kind of have this entrepreneurial Wild West, by God, no one's going to tell me what to do. All right.
Right.
You look around the world, and governments and societies are slightly different. Oh, by the way, Manuel, something that you and I talked about is a lot of the solutions, a lot of the built environment solutions, a lot of the financial solutions are developed in the United States, but not deployed here. Sponge City, the whole Sponge City concept, which was the realization that we put so much concrete in so many places, the absorptive capacity, right, had gone away. So now we're just creating flash flood and flooding in places that didn't have it before. All right. So a group of leading firms in design and engineering and others come together in the United States and UK. But where did they go launch Sponge City? In
China.
Wuhan, China, which now has a
Absolutely.
national effort right around the world in Sponge City, meaning you're going to have to tear up some of the concrete. You're going to have to replace it with certain things, meaning more grass, more nature, but also come up with different clever ways of managing flood and water. Meanwhile, we do it around the world. Getting it in the United States seems to be a functional hurdle of either the champions we need not having voice enough, or we're still going to have to wait until it becomes more painful, which is terrible.